Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here today. I'm Eric Stoken, Acting Director of the Center for Social Science Scholarship. I'm excited to welcome you today for a discussion about making informed policy decisions by drawing on evidence-based practice, featuring our keynote speaker, Dr. Michael Fernandez. Please note that another panel that will be of interest to many of you here today will be happening on October 23rd at 4:30 p.m. here in the library gallery. CS3, the Center for Social Science Scholarship, is hosting social science research in government, business, and nonprofit careers, an alumni panel, where we will have a panel discussion featuring 4 alumni from across the social sciences who will describe their experiences applying UMBC social science research training to their professional careers. To learn about these and many other CS3 planned events this semester, please visit our website, socialscience.umbc.edu, and subscribe to our events calendar. We're on LinkedIn, Facebook, X, Instagram, all the socials. You can also tune in to our podcast, Retrieving the Social Sciences, which you can find on Spotify, Apple, or Amazon. I want to introduce Dr. Michael Fernandez. Dr. Michael Fernandez is the director of the American Association for the Advancement of Science's Center for Scientific Evidence in Public Issues, or the EPI Center. They hold a Ph.D. in biochemistry and molecular biology from the University of Chicago and a bachelor's degree in biology from Princeton University. Dr. Fernandez is a public affairs expert with a proven track record in government, nonprofit, and the private sector. Their core expertise is in food and agriculture, environmental sustainability, health and nutrition, and biotech policy. As director of the EPI Center, Dr. Fernandez works to translate scientific evidence for public policymakers. In this way, their center helps to demonstrate the relevance of independent, nonpartisan scientific evidence for public choices. Dr. Fernandez has worked on issues ranging from responsible AI use in local and state governments, PFAS, green infrastructure, and voting technology and security. Today, they will focus their talk on the issues around PFAS and voting technology. Again, thank you for being here. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Fernandez.
Thank you. Old school, I have to have paper. And I'll see if I can make these things work as well. So thank you very much, Eric, and everyone who made it possible, who invited me and made it possible for me to be here. I'm super excited. I am also, I will admit, more than a tiny bit nervous. I'm not a social scientist. I do not have any academic training in what I'm going to talk about. So I have been doing this for 30 plus years. But I am much more of a practitioner than I am an academic when it comes to the science of talking about science to people. In part of my career, I worked for a big food company, and it's headquartered in McLean, Virginia, and it's this tiny little office, and to try to make people feel some sense of community in this tiny little office of people who work globally and travel all the time. They would do these monthly meetings, and if your birthday fell in the month, they would have these things. You had to get up and say something about you that no one else knew. So I was a pretty new hire, and they just had hired me as the director of global public policy for this big $30 billion company. And I got up and said, well, hi, I'm Michael Fernandez. I'm the director of global public policy. I don't have a degree in public policy, and in fact, I've never taken a public policy course. I thought it was kind of funny. It was maybe not a career-enhancing move. But anyway, so I am trying, now that I have set the bar low, I will again jump in. And what I'm going to talk about today is a little bit about the center, sort of how and why we got started, how we work, where we fit in this context, in this constellation of people who are working on science and science policy, and then specifically some examples on voting technology and PFAS chemicals and sort of what we have learned and how we've evolved over time. So we got started in 2018, almost exactly 6 years ago, in October of 2018. I was a center of one for a while, so this was a project that I'm the founding director in theory. A lot of people assume that this was in response to the 2016 election, that this was a moment of time where science was being science and scientific expertise in general being sort of dismissed, which is all true. But in fact, the project had been conceived many years earlier by our then CEO, is Rush Holt, who's a former congressman from New Jersey, was a physicist himself, and was very interested in sort of evidence and decision making, and had been watching the sort of erosion of the infrastructure for evidence to be, being in Congress in particular. So the Office of Technology Assessment was gutted or disappeared in sort of the mid-90s, and so he had this idea and then started to put this project together. So we started then I started in 2018, and we were 2 years into the Trump administration, where you were seeing not just the sort of historic erosion of this kind of infrastructure, but really active dismissal of it. So people may remember things like the Environmental Protection Agency's Scientific Advisory Committee, where everyone sort of resigned en masse because they weren't being listened to, all kinds of things like that. So that was the context in which this project started. So the idea of talking about scientific evidence and the importance of evidence in general and expertise in general in decision-making in Washington, D.C. was a little challenging, which is why, in part of why we chose to focus more on state and local decision-makers than decision-makers at the federal government. Part of that was the environment. Part of it, most of it, was we felt that the need was much stronger. There's plenty of partisanships still in those places as well, but they're a little bit closer to their constituents, and they're being held a little bit more accountable for delivering stuff. And also there's less of an ability to get that kind of information and analyze it than people in the federal government. The access to information is not really the biggest barrier for incorporating information in the federal government. But I think it is more so at a state and local level, and I'll talk a little bit, maybe show some examples where I think that that's true. All right, probably, let's see, where are we? See if I can make this happen. How about that? Okay. All right, so this is a little bit of the theoretical part, to the extent that I know that. This is the context that we're operating in. How do we think about it? And one of the things that I knew for certain is that what I did not want to do is this sort of old school deficit model kind of approach, where if you only just knew what we knew, you would make better decisions. If you just listened to us, the scientists, everything would be better. That was not going to go over well, and it never goes over well, and it was certainly not going to go over well in that environment. You don't know if you're just parachuting in, you're not sure what you're landing into, right? But there are some things that people know. People have talked about these things. These are some things that some of my colleagues worked on earlier, and some ideas of like, okay, well, what do you really need to do? Some of this recommended practices was done by a bunch of interviews of congressional staff and members of Congress, sort of thinking about, it's establishing trust, it's building relationships, it's being relevant. Science is only one of the things that people are considering. And it all, I think, comes down to the biggest thing is sort of building long-term trusted relationships. Not easy to do, and especially not easy to do at a state and local level when we're a handful of people in Washington, D.C., and not the most obvious thing in some ways. So our mission. So this is the way we describe our mission, which is about, as I said, about building trusted relationships between scientists and policymakers, making it easier for people to access that information and use it. And it also makes it easier for scientists to engage with policymakers at scale. So for us, I should have started, I meant to start with this about the American Association for the Advancement of Science, which is where I work, which is the world's largest scientific society, general scientific society. So it is a membership-based organization of 90 to 100,000-ish kind of members. It publishes Science magazine and the Science families of journals, and also has a programmatic side, which is obviously where I live. But this idea of we have some responsibility to the scientific community to be able to provide opportunities for scientists who want to engage with policymakers. We are resolutely nonpartisan, and in fact, we do not advocate for any particular policy outcomes. We do advocate for using scientific evidence in decision making, but what we say is if you care about this issue, in which we think you should for this reason, for these X, Y, and Z reasons, here is some evidence that can help you in your decision making. I think that non-advocacy thing, I think, is an interesting, and it's really an important part of what we do. And we have found that both the nonpartisanship and that sort of not being perceived as having an axe to grind in the issue has been really important for policymakers, and we've heard that from them directly. It does make it really hard to assess the impact of what we're doing, right? Because what we say is, well, if you consider the evidence, great, right? And we're not advocating for a particular policy outcome. If I were advocating for do this, that would be very easy to measure, and there were steps along the way. Oh, they had a hearing, they did a whatever, all those things that you could measure. So it makes it a challenge for us. You may notice, for example, that what I'm just saying, this mission doesn't talk about, it talks about using evidence, but not about influencing policy decisions. We do want to influence policy decisions, but it was pretty intentional in our statement to not talk about that. But as I said, it does make it a little hard to measure. I'll talk a little bit more in a minute about network building and the partnerships. And the other thing I think that that I think sets us apart in some way is really in our ability to sort of be responsive to the needs of the stakeholders and to sort of shift. And so that's one of the themes that I'll talk about in the rest of this talk is really thinking about some examples of where we have had to sort of shift our approach or shift the way we were doing some stuff. Okay, so what I like to call our approach is mediated engagement, right? So it always starts with listening. So over on the left side, so that's really understanding what the policy landscape looked like, what's the scientific evidence base look like, what are the issues that are most important to the affected communities, which is the hardest part for us in terms of the listening to be able to do. So that really shapes how we think about the issues, what are the issues that we want to talk about, what are the specific parts of any kind of issue. But it's really about putting the decision makers and the experts together. So we do not write a lot of reports. If you go to our website, you're not going to see a bunch of reports. You're going to see stuff about convenings that we have done. So it's really in this mediated engagement, which is a curated kind of engagement that on specific topics that's really about sharing insights and building trust. And one of the key things in this is the mediation is sort of us, but it's also partnerships, partner organizations that we work with, which really helps, creates ongoing relationships for us with these organizations, but they are also an important conduit for us and the decision makers. Ultimately, in the end, what we're looking for is evidence-informed decision-making, as we like to call it. So where does this fit into the bigger ecosystem? And this is I made this all up, so you can feel free to tear it apart as you want, but I see we're in the space of evidence for policy. There are other people where I work at AAAS who are in the policy for science, sense. So people who are thinking about the scientific enterprise and the policy, policy choices that impact the scientific enterprise. And we're really thinking about the science as a contributor to policy development in all kinds of public issues. But there are a lot of ways that you could do that, right? I talked a little bit about this mediated engagement model. There are lots of existing models in other ways. There are science and technology policy fellowships where scientists, usually early career scientists, would get embedded in a congressional office or whatever. That was how I started what I do now. I mean, I came from graduate school and wasn't sure that I really wanted to do the lab for that much longer, and did a one-year fellowship that was actually AAAS, Science and Technology Policy Fellowship, working on the Hill, and that was 30 plus years ago, never left. Those, and they all have different kind of characteristics that, there's a really close personal relationship. You're directly involved in the development and implementation of stuff. And there's this large alumni network. There's thousands of us, former fellows. But you're being hired, you're being brought in as a scientific expert, just as a scientific expert in that case, not on a specific topic, generally speaking. You're not coming in as a person. Did molecular biology, I worked for the Agriculture Committee. I know lots of people who were, I was a climate, a soil scientist, then I did energy, right? It's they want somebody who has that scientific knowledge and that scientific understanding, but it's not about advising on specific topics per se, right? There's also this kind of civic engagement model. So local, empowering, these are hyper-local, sort of empowering scientists to engage directly in their community, right? So it builds that community engagement. They have inherent trust, but they're, people talk about it as like this army that you've gone out there, but I think of it as like a militia, right? There's no one directing you. You still have to figure out, well, what is it that people care about? And you can get trained in how to talk to them, but you're kind of on your own in that model. And not everybody has that kind of time or that, the desire to do that kind of work. There are the national academies sorts of approach, right? They're great. People request stuff. And they get this, so they usually have sort of they're quasi-governmental, so they have a government kind of seal of approval. But they're, generally speaking, the National Academy of Sciences, they spend 2 years doing a thing, they write a giant report, the committee disbands, and that's it, right? So, and then there's us, and I talked about the partnership, which I'll talk about in a minute, but for us, it's really a scale multiplier. We're a small group of people, so those partners, think the National Governors Association or whoever who are their members are the people we're trying to reach. That gives us a scale. We're really about actionable evidence that's responsive to the stakeholder needs. So what is it that you're looking for? How do you want to be talked to? How do you want to understand this? What are the questions that you have? What's the best way to do it? And as I said, it's really about these sort of curated engagements. I no longer remember what page I'm on. So as I say, partnerships, right, our greatest asset, and you'll see these are all institutions that we've partnered with. Everyone from sort of the White House, from federal, state, local, and as I said, part of this is scale, right? We can reach all of the governors at one time, in theory, right, or their offices, which I could not do one by one if it was just me and 3 other people. There's also, we come in as a trusted source of information, and they are already trusted sources of information for their members. So when we partner with them on activities of bringing their members and scientists together, we come with an extra halo of trust. And it does, as I said, build scale. So this gives you just a sense, since we started work really in 2019, we've had engagements with, sort of more than 6,000 decision makers at kind of all levels of the government, and including, a couple thousand people in state and local, each in state and local governments, right? So we could really reach, it's a lot of people. And as you see from this map, I don't actually have a map that reflects those numbers exactly, but this is just from one particular year. It's in red states, it's in blue states, it's everywhere, people across the country. We have reached people in every state, except maybe Mississippi, and I won't say anything anymore about that. But so that's sort of the scale that we're talking about. All right, so to some specific topics. So first thing I want to talk about was a voting system. technology and security. So just as a little bit of background, after the election in 2000, if people remember hanging chads and the nightmare of counting and the election going to ultimately the Supreme Court, there was the Help America Vote Act, which was trying to modernize voting systems and did really radically change how people vote. There was people at the time and subsequently saying, well, you didn't really actually talk to security experts, computer experts, people that you would probably really want to talk to about some of this kind of stuff. And so sort of now, several years later, we have a big National Academy of Sciences study. This is Securing the Vote. That's looking at, what do we know now about the voting system? And there were three big chunks of stuff that we wanted to talk about, which is about the voting machines, the voting system technology itself, and that human readable paper ballots is the way to go. It's kind of entertaining because it's computer scientists saying vote on paper, so that's sort of fun. It's also about the post-election auditing process, and there's sort of a scientifically validated approach to auditing and assuring the results of elections. And then there was some future-looking stuff about, well, what's the next kind of technology going to look like? And one of the clear conclusions there is online voting options, not a good idea. So this report is like 350 pages. No county clerk in this country is going to read this report and understand it and be able to sort of incorporate it into the decisions, and they're the ones who decide, well, what voting machines are we going to buy? What are we going to do, right? So our job is really distilling that evidence into a more manageable, more accessible, more useful thing. It's also curating, right? There's a ton of stuff in this report that's really important to elections. There's a lot of stuff about, not so much then about social media, but some kinds of stuff like that. There's a lot of stuff about ballot design and all kinds of elements that are really important, but we chose the things that we thought were the most important and were most relevant for what the kinds of evidence that we could provide. So delivering the evidence. One of the things that I didn't say before is when I put up my mission statement, it was about building trusted relationships. Originally, it was about that mission statement said that what we do is deliver clear, concise, and actionable scientific evidence to decision makers. That clear, concise, and actionable is still really important, but we shifted from delivering to sort of building relationships. What you'll see here is that the way we talked about it then, when we first started this project, this was our first project, really was about delivering the evidence. And we did that by reaching out to thousands of election officials around the country, right? So there were 11 states that were using voting machines that had no paper record. So it would be impossible to validate whether the results that were showing up in the machine were actually what people voted. And this was a problem. And so we did that by just sending out letters to people, right? We distilled this down into here's a 2-page thing that this is what we think. Most of that went into a void, right? I never heard from anybody. We sent it, unless it bounced back, I think it went to somebody's email inbox, but most of them, we didn't hear from. So we had to start thinking, okay, well, how else are we going to do something that's really going to make a difference? And so we started really then thinking about, well, what's the environment around those decision makers? And some of that was around media engagement, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. Also, the county clerks are the people who are sort of ultimately buying the machines, kind of making that decision, but it's the county commissioners who are appropriating the money for it. So that was one thing where we kind of shifted from the clerks. If we weren't hearing from them, well, let's talk to the people who are holding the purse. And here's some questions that you could be asking the people who are coming to you wanting to sell you machines, right? What you see on the upper right there, this is in Taylor County, Texas. And I don't think you probably can see it on the picture, but if I blew it up really big, this is a local TV reporter who's holding up a letter that we sent. And if you look closely, you can see our logo up at the top of it, which our funders love. And the show is Getting the Facts Right is the name of the show, right? And we had sent this letter saying, here's what you should know. And they end up going, okay, well, you commissioners, you guys are going to vote on this. Answer these questions, right? So in Taylor County, they bought the wrong machines. I mean, I don't say the wrong machines. We say we don't advocate, but they did not buy the machines that the scientists would say were the most secure. But I know that they considered this evidence. They at least saw it, and they had to pay attention to it. So for us, this was kind of a win in a way. But in the end, the policy choice that they made was maybe not the one that the evidence would most encourage you to. So that's sort of one of those tricky ones for us to think about. Again, talked about media. So once this sort of happened in Taylor County, we started being more intentional about this. And this is one that I like. This was in Kansas. We wrote, did one of these things. We sort of sent it in, and we talked to a local newspaper, and they wrote. There was a story in the local newspaper in Kansas about there are these 8 counties in Kansas that are using these machines. So, and then it got picked up by the Associated Press, and then the editorial board of this paper was like, wow. So then they wrote an editorial about it, which then attracted some more attention in the kind of state and locally. And then you have what you see at the lower right is the Secretary of State in an on-camera interview being asked questions about these machines and ultimately saying, yeah, you're right. We do need to change this system. So this is one where it really did work. But it was this sort of apparatus around the decision makers. And then in late 2019, I also have no idea what time it is, so will you tell me when I should move faster? In late 2019, we were talking about voting machine technology. It was now too late for people to be changing their systems, and we did not want to contribute to people's skepticism about the voting process, which turned out to be somewhat prescient. And so we were already sort of thinking about how are we going to shift our discussion in here. And we had a couple of thoughts, and one of them was this, what I mentioned earlier was about sort of the new voting technology. And there were some small vendors who were starting to approach state governments about using online voting systems, apps and other sort of online voting systems. All the computer scientists say the current technology, there's no way that you can do that is both safe and private. We can talk, if anyone wants to talk about it, I can talk about it at more length than anyone wants to know, but it's extremely difficult to do. So we sort of shifted tactics here, which is that what you see in the middle is a kind of an open letter that we did with a bunch of groups, some of which at the top you see, the Common Cause, the Brennan Center, a number of others, the ACM, the Association of Computer Manufacturing, which is really just the Computer Science Association. And we did this open letter that we sent to every governor, secretary of state, and state election official. And about, I don't know how many now it is, but about 100 sort of computer experts and other scientists signed on to this letter. And for us, this was a different approach. It was really taking a much more forward, much more kind of leadership position. And it really did have a different kind of impact in terms of the way it shaped the national debate and, I think, voting policies. What you'll see at the bottom right is a little hard to read, but was a nice example where we had sent this, and one of the people who was getting it was in the governor's office in Puerto Rico. There was a bill that was in the legislature at the time that was a big voting bill, and part of it was moving much more to online voting. This was at a time when many people in Puerto Rico still didn't have electricity after hurricane, so it seemed like an odd choice from a policy perspective because a lot of people were not going to be able to access it. But they got this letter, and they, through some other people, reached out to us, and we went and spoke with the governors, not me, but we went and spoke with the governor's staff, and then like 3 days later, the governor does, of course, making policy by tweet, puts out a tweet saying that I'm sending this back to the legislature because of my concerns about the cybersecurity and those risks. This is one where, again, where there was I can draw a clear line to, change in policy. It also became much more important when, in 2020, people were desperately looking for other ways to vote than having a bunch of people come into one room on the same day. Suddenly this thing that we were like, well, this is sort of in the future, was really getting pushed, on a pretty heavy basis. All right, that's voting. So now I'm going to shift. PFAS policy solutions. So PFAS, for people if you don't know, these are often referred to as forever chemicals. They're per and polyfluoral alkyl substances is what PFAS stands for. They are synthetic chemicals that have water and grease resistance, fire retardants. They have many, many, many uses in in our world today. There are thousands of them. 9 or 10,000 of these chemicals. It's a big, giant family, of which, fewer than 10 are regulated in sort of any way, and we don't have much data on any more than those kind of 10. They are ubiquitous in our environment. They're used in all kinds of products, firefighting foam, consumer products. Think, your waterproof clothing and Teflon pans. They are called forever chemicals because they're extraordinarily hard to destroy. They have this carbon-fluorine bond that's in them as one of the strongest known, and they're extremely difficult to get rid of. So they last forever in the environment. They bioaccumulate, and so if you eat a lot of fish, they have accumulated a bunch of PFAS. That's your there's all kinds of routes of exposure, and they are linked to a number of problematic health effects. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about this. This is a very busy slide, which I did for one of our funders, so it's busy on purpose to make it look like we were doing lots of stuff. And I promise that I won't talk about every one of these things. But when we're talking about building trusted relationships, this is what it takes. So it starts in 2019, it ends in 2023 right there when we did this slide. There's more beyond there. I just didn't make somebody make a new one. So it takes, it took a long time. And it really starts with the listening, as I said. So the very first thing we did was a listening session with the National League of Cities. They had a bunch of people who were flying into DC to talk about some other stuff. And we said, okay, let's tack on another couple of days. And we had a 2-day meeting, and really, what do you understand? What do you know about these things? We had some experts come in so there was some mutual benefit, right? They learned something, and it wasn't just us learning from them. We learned a couple of things. One is there are some people in this group who are saying, I don't really know anything about these things. I don't really think we have it. This isn't a problem for us. And I'm like, yeah, it is. You just don't know yet. And then there were other people who are the real leaders. So in states like Michigan and Wisconsin, or Minnesota, where they found some issues quite early because they were manufacturing or big users that had contaminated water systems, they were way ahead, right? So that was one of the interesting insights for me, is in these situations where there's the leaders and the laggards, the peer-to-peer learning was as important as anything that they heard from us or from the experts. Yes, and what we heard from somebody is yes, this is a thing I should be paying attention to. Other people are doing stuff, which there's a little bit of a competition thing. There's also a little permission, I could do something. And there is scientific evidence that might help me in my decision making. So that sort of launched us on this journey. We started in another year later. Then there's COVID, right? So this is one of these places where there's a shift, right? This first meeting was an in-person meeting. We imagined we would do more of these, right? They were like, one of the things that said is, do more of these. We're not doing any more of those, suddenly. So we really had to shift in thinking about, well, how do we do this? One of the things they also said is there's nothing that's really written for us. There are 300-page, science reports. There are one-page things. Here's, PFAS on one page, but like I'm a local, these are municipal leaders. I need something more. I don't need the first one, but I need something more than the one-pager. So we produced a bunch of guides. That's one of the things that we did when we were trying to figure out, well, how are we gonna engage people? And then we started doing these sort of, virtual roundtables with a bunch of partners. I won't go through all those. NGA, National Governors Association, the AFSTO is the Association of State and Territorial Health Officials, Environmental Council of States, a bunch of these, organizations, these civic intermediary organizations that their members had a real interest in this, and what this was all about was really about awareness building, relationship building, really understanding what are these technologies, what are you concerned about, how can we help you, and developing these partnerships. And then as you see all the way over on the top, all the way over on the right, the IIJA, this is a bipartisan infrastructure bill. That happens, there's billions of dollars suddenly for PFAS remediation in communities. So now the conversation in the policy space is really shifting to an implementation phase in a way. What do I do with this? I want to get this money. How do I get it? And if I do, what should I do with it? Right? How do I make choices about it's not nearly enough money to solve this problem? So where should I be, focusing my attention? Then that's sort of the, end of 2021. In 2022, there's also, then you're starting to see some more federal action now, right? So the EPA proposes to list a handful of PFAS chemicals as Superfund chemicals. So then suddenly water systems, municipal water systems are like, well, what, am I going to be a Superfund site, right? There's like all these kinds of policy questions. Well, what does this mean? What does this mean for us? So we did a bunch of, kind of webinars, public events on this question of PFAS and Superfund. Also, people were like, well, okay, now I have them. I know they're there. How do I get rid of them? You're telling me these are really hard to get rid of, and there are some new technologies. So that was another thing we heard. So we did a bunch of things on destruction and technology. Interesting one for me is this, the one that's in the middle of the bottom row, the science of PFAS exposure and effects on human health. That was with ASTO. As I said, they were one of our very early partners, but surprisingly, for much of 21 and 22 and into 23, they were not really interested in talking about anything other than COVID and what we were doing in our communities, right? And then when they started to be able to lift their head up, they were like, yeah, we really are. We know that this is an issue and really wanted to talk more about it, and we really want to understand what the health effects are and how do we talk to the people in our communities. So that was part of what we did there. And then finally, we're starting to see more pull from decision makers about specific problems that they have. There's one in New Mexico in here, which I think is on there, where this was an example where people had cows that were milk cows, dairy cows that were that got through contaminated water. The cows had PFAS, and then the milk was contaminated. They have to destroy the milk, but then they have these cows. And we're like, well, what do we do with them, right? As it turns out, there's not a great answer, but we brought in they put out a request for information, and we brought in a bunch of scientists, and we did a special meeting for them, which is say, okay, well, here's what we know, and here, the best thing you can do, I won't go into the best thing you can do is basically stick them in a pit. But this is like, we're starting, now really getting pull on sort of specific kinds of questions. And then, the last thing, well, two things, and these are the last things that I will talk about, was also in 2023, there were no federal standards, drinking water standards for PFAS at all. And so the EPA proposed the first ones in 2023, which have now since subsequently been finalized for 6 PFAS chemicals. And the drinking water limit is effectively 0. It's at or below the level of detection. So these are, effectively banning these things. So people are really like, well, now what do I do? And we need to, as a state, we need to have our own sort of approach and our own policies. And so the last thing that you see on this slide, and I'll actually turn to the next one, which is, I believe, the last slide, which I won't talk about all of these, but there's these PFAS state policy planning summits. So we partnered with the National Governors Association and we put out an RFP for we will come. We will come, we will bring people, we will come together, you tell us what you're interested in, and we will pick one of you, and bring people for a 2-day in-person summit, what you see on, I think that picture on the upper right. So we're now coming full circle back to in-person again. But this is really now a state saying so this was Colorado was the pilot in 2024. We had an action plan, but now so much has changed. We need to do a new one. Will you help us? And so they brought representatives from like 10 different state agencies in Colorado. This was May of 2023, and in January of 2023, so like 6 months-ish later, they published a new action plan 2.0, right? And they very explicitly acknowledged that this planning summit was the thing that really kicked it off, and there were lots of things that were discussed in that meeting that are now part of Colorado's state action plan. So it's nice for us because we can draw a connect line to those things, and they really talk about it directly. And that process of bringing the people together in that kind of way. We have now done 2 more. So this year we were in Ohio, and there it was a specific issue, which was PFAS in private drinking water wells. So most people, when you think about PFAS in drinking water, it's in municipal systems, right? So you're in a city, you're in Baltimore, you have a municipal water system. It's a big deal, but it's a centralized place where you can at least sort of think, it's easier to think about how would you manage that in some ways, right? The best way is sort of filtered out, and then what you do with those filters is a whole separate question. But private wells, many millions and millions of Americans get their drinking water from private wells. And so what do you do about that? It's a very, it's a much more dispersed, it's a much more, diffuse, and they're unregulated, and there's not a lot of help for them. So this is Ohio. It's like they already had a pretty robust plan, but this is a hole that we know. So we brought in a bunch of experts to help them, and they've now, have a proposed private well program that they're trying to get through the state government right now. And then Maryland was most recently about PFAS in biosolids and spray irrigation, which is really a food issue, right? So if you get PFAS in biosolids, use it as fertilizer, gets taken up by the plants, and there's a bunch of technical questions about how does this happen? Should I really care about it? Is this the biggest issue or not? Whatever. But and both of these ones, the reasons we were interested in them, in part because of all 3 of these, but particularly Ohio and Maryland, one's run. You have a Republican governor and a Democratic governor, but also they're a little bit different geography, and these are issues that every state has. So what the plan is that after Ohio and Maryland get through all of their sort of planning process, so call it Q1 or Q2 of next year, we will bring representatives from all 3 of these states together to talk about what they learned at these things and make that available to all the members of the National Governors Association. So trying to again get that, and publicly, but get that information more broadly available to people. That's it. I have no idea what time it is, sorry.
We have probably about 20 minutes
great,
or so
perfect.
for questions, and I'll just kind of kick it off. First, I want to thank you, not only for presenting, but also for the work that you do. I know there's a lot of students here who are focused on public policy, and I want to just impress upon you that, in part, you and your efforts and your organizations help to counteract misinformation and also provide information in this space where you might otherwise just have lobbying interests that have some sort of vested interest. So it's very important, the work that you do. How do you judge quality evidence? Could you talk a little bit about that? You know, if you're getting different sources of information, what does that look like, and how do you communicate that?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it's the thing that keeps me up at night. I mean, it doesn't. There are lots of things do, but it's for me. I think being wrong. If we were being wrong, would be a fall from grace that would really be hard to recover from. I think the other things are being seen as partisan, being seen as having an axe to grind. I think those things would also be really hard, but I really think being wrong would be the worst thing. So we are generally, part of it goes to what topics do we work on. So, you know, we pick them. It's mostly push more than pull right now. So we're looking for something where there is a well-established evidence base, right? So that it's not, we're not looking at the thing where here's the latest, newest, you know, study or science. It's the, you know, the cutting edge new science. Sometimes it is, and a lot in the destruction space in PFAS, for example. But we're really looking for a place where there is that sort of evidence base that's generally recognized, right? We are not subject matter experts on any of these things. We do belong to the world's largest general scientific society, so we have lots of experts to draw from. And I didn't talk about, but cross-disciplinary too. In the voting space, there's a lot of social science evidence that's really important for thinking about how people vote and how they feel about voting and how they feel about if you change my voting system. One of the things is if you change it even to something that's more secure, everyone assumes that it's less, right? Any change is bad in that situation. So that's what we look for. So having that National Academy of Sciences report, for example, on the voting was a great one because we can go, okay, here's this thing. Let's pick the things that we think are the most important. But it's really a challenge. And in the voting space, I started doing this project. You know, Rush Holt, who was our CEO, that was also part of the reason we chose that because he really liked the idea. And I started doing it as just me. And before I hired anyone. And I talked to a bunch of people. He said, go talk to these people. And there's this guy at Princeton, and there's this guy at Michigan, and there's this guy wherever. And I'm like, great. So I went and talked to them. They were all guys, by the way. And they said, well, you should talk to this person, and you should talk to this person, and you should talk to this person. And I'm like, okay, great. I really understand what's going on. And then, you know, hired some people, and one of the people I hired, who was a social psychologist, ends up running this project on voting technology, and talked to many more people. And there were a whole bunch of things that we would have missed if it had just been me doing it the way I had done it. And some of this was the social science, some of it was some other stuff, some of it was just lived experience and practical things. One of the things I didn't say in the voting was when the first thing that we actually did was just cold call. We picked one state, which was New Jersey, and cold called all of the county clerks. And some of them, you know, wouldn't talk to us, and some of them did. And some of the things you heard were like, well, we have had these paperless machines for, you know, now, like, you know, decade. We just moved into a new office. There's no place for me to store paper. If I had to do paper ballots, I don't know where to put them. And like, it was a thing that really mattered. And they said, that guy from Princeton, he comes in and says, you people are idiots, and I'm suing you. And then, goes back to his office at Princeton. So, I think if we had not done more of that kind of listening, we would have missed stuff.
Maybe to pull the thread on that a little bit.
Please.
And using your PFAS example, there's a lot of stakeholders there that are moving at different velocities.
Yeah.
Sadly, the federal government appears to be lagging in terms of a whole lot of stuff. But how do you integrate that?
Yeah.
So that it's not just the fastest and loudest, but it's the fastest, the loudest, perhaps, and the rightest.
Yeah.
you know, and things like that. How do you balance that when you're then building something that a non-technical, albeit decision maker, is going to use?
Yeah.
It's just not the bright, shiny, flashy thing.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, some of it is this real focus on listening and really trying to understand what it is that the people that we're trying to reach, what it is that they know and don't know, and what they want to know and how they want to get it, which that last part is harder. We are also, like, the person who runs that project is, participates in a lot of other sort of coalitions. There are some of which include government scientists, some of which are not, you know, so there are, we have to rely on others. And one of the things that has been most interesting for me and voting is a better example in some ways, but it's the same in both, that we worked with a lot of the, sort of advocacy organizations, and they knew that we could get into rooms that they couldn't, in part. And I was worried that we were coming into this topic, and there were a lot of people who had been working on voting technology for, at least a decade, right? And they're like, who the hell are you? And, who needs you? We don't need you. We're already doing this. And people were very welcoming. And the same has been true in the PFAS space, where there's a lot of people who have been working on it for a long time, but they're like, the more the merrier, and respect what we do and how we bring people together. So I think it's hard not to get distracted by the shiny object. We have another project on artificial intelligence and state and local government using artificial intelligence or algorithmic tools in delivering of public services, which I think is a really interesting slice of the whole AI thing. And it's been, I'm like, this is great. Nobody else is really talking about this. It's really interesting. There's a lot of procurement policy and other stuff that really would make a difference. And it's been hard, and we had our sort of regular partners. That's another nice thing about these projects is, like, the National League of Cities, the National Governors Association. We've established these partners with them in a bit of a more global way. So they were like, yes, we have people working on this too. Let's work together on that, right? Then they kind of went silent. And they all have we have a working group on whatever, and it's being funded by Google. It's whatever. So it has been more of a challenge in that space where there are, very wealthy and powerful vested interests. And even if I'm not saying they're evil, I don't even want to cast aspersions, but it's hard for us to gain the same kind of traction and to get the same kind of engagement.
Given that this, at least for a little while longer, is a democracy, it's interesting that you went to policymakers instead of the constituents they theoretically
Yeah.
answer to. And I'm just picking up some really interesting things that I can imagine were part of that decision. I want to hear what you have to say, but the emphasis on relational work, how could you do that with an entire population?
Right.
And it seems it's such a great idea. But also the subjects that you're picking just seem like, they kind of like, does the public really care what brand of voting machine, or how are you going to get the public anyway interested about a particular chemical, and what is that thing? So, like, are the subjects picked for, like, policymaker level?
For sure.
Yeah.
Yes, so that's part of, so the way usually the first question I get is, how do you pick topics? And it's more art than science, honestly, but, we start with a big funnel and, sort of narrow them down. And some of them are really interesting science topics, but there's not really a policy component. Some of them, the science is really interesting, but the policy, and there's a big policy debate, but the big policy debate is about something other than science, and the science isn't going to make any difference. We have not done climate science we did not do as a topic, because the climate science is known, and people who are arguing about climate science it's not about science, it's about something else, right? So we're not going to change anybody's positions by giving them more science. But they do have to, so we have a series of sort of 9 or 10 questions that we ask ourselves around what's the evidence base, and is there a you know, a live policy debate, or do we imagine there is one, will be one, anticipate there will be one, and can we make a difference, right? And so it's part of that is sort of who's going to listen to us and how would we engage. We have not done any sort of campaigns that are aimed more just at consumers, more than at you know, just you know, regular folk, but it's not impossible. I mean, I can't imagine that we would, but I don't know how we would do that with the apparatus and the structures that we have right now. One of the things we have done, there's a separate project on green infrastructure and nature-based solutions to water management, right? Which is, so we don't do climate science, but lots of climate-related topics. We have some other stuff in energy and environment space as well. And that was really kind of interesting because it started it really started with the federal government. We said, I can't remember exactly, Rebecca tells the story better than I do, but ultimately there was a federal green infrastructure collaborative that had existed that was wiped out in the Trump administration, and they were trying to bring it back. And because we approached them saying, we'd like to bring this, you know, a group of people together to talk about this green infrastructure, including federal agencies. And they were like, we've been trying to do this. We really want to do it. Can you do it for us? And we were like, yeah, we could do it in, you know, 6 months. And they're like, it would take us, you know, 3 years. And we did, and that's where it started. And it was really sort of exciting, and they really liked it. And we brought in some people from different states. And then what we ended up doing was a series of regionally focused, because the challenges are similar in regions but different from each other regions, right? The arid Southwest and the Pacific Northwest are very different in terms of their water issues. But green infrastructure is relevant for both of them. So we did these regional focused sessions, and with partnering with the White House and CEQ and EPA, because they really wanted to listen. And what we did was highlight what's working in these places. So there we were highlighting like community organizations, you know, a lot of that, what's happening is people are trying to do a thing in their, you know, in their neighborhood, right? So it was really sort of building connections between federal, state, and all the way to local. And I was at a meeting where somebody was talking about this. Somebody in a community-based organization in New Orleans, it's not somebody that we had worked with, that was with a bunch of water funders. And they were like, what do you need? And the first thing she's like, well, I need a new desk. You know, like I just need stuff, right? I have no money. But also, you know, but one of the things that she said is like, I want to make lasting change. And there's, again, in the IIJA, there's billions of dollars out there. And people are really focused about it. Like, how do we just get that money into the ground, right? How do we get it to people to, you know, how do we help them obtain that money? And that's what a lot of the funding was focusing on. And this woman who runs this organization said, you know, that's great and we need all of that, but I want lasting change. And for me to be able to have a lasting change, I need to be able to have the relationships with the people at my state level and the people at the federal government level, right? So I need somebody who can help me do that. And I'm like, great. But as it turns out, the water funders didn't think that sounded so great. So we've kind of put that project a little bit quiet while we look for more funding. But that question about how do you have the impact that you want, and how do you understand what the people in the impacted communities? It's really easy for me to sit in Washington. I've been doing this for a really long time. In terms of kind of science and policy sort of stuff, to forget about that these policies, these laws, these regulations, whatever it is, actually have real impact on real people, right? So it's something that it's not easy for us to make those connections, because I can go to, you know, wherever, and, you know, New Orleans, and say, oh, here's what I can do for you. They're like, who are you? You don't know anything about what's happening here, you know, and I wouldn't even, you know, presume to. So how can we build those connections in a way that supports what those people are doing, and that we can understand what they need, but not presume to say, oh, here, I'm coming from DC to help you.
Go ahead. scientists and doctors, you know, and experts, you know, on the subject testifying, you know, and speaking
Yep.
favorably. You know, I imagine it's a very common issue for climate scientists as well. So, but my question is more so, how do you engage with, you know, policymakers who are so politically driven on this specific issue,
Yeah.
coming from a very specific stance that is so reticent to any kind of evidence really that doesn't fit with their agenda?
Yeah.
While still, you know, like how do you maintain that, you know, focus on that while still being able to be invited at the table, so to speak?
It's really hard. So in some cases, we have, I mean, I can give you a couple of examples. So we have a long list of things that we would like to work on. We have not done any work on reproductive rights, for example. There's a huge evidence base of all kinds. My personal belief is that the debate there is not going to be changed by what I might say or what we might say about the evidence there. I could be wrong. I've been really interested in topics around gender identity, gender transition, medical care, supporting people. There is tons of evidence there. It's also extremely controversial, and there are lots of the debate is about something else. But it does kind of lead us to shy away from controversial topics that I'm not sure is great. I mean, in a way, I can justify it from a where I think I can have an impact kind of perspective, but it doesn't always feel great. And so I think, is there an opportunity for us? We're still relatively new, and not that many people know who we are, and we're not trying to make a big splashy thing. You're not going to see my name in the newspaper. But I think I don't know when we can be a little braver on some of the more controversial topics. But we do depend on those partner organizations too, in some ways, in order to gain access to the people that we want to try to reach. And I think those are topics that they also probably shy away from. So it is a challenge. That's not a very satisfying answer, but.
I think we have time for one more.
Okay. This was so fascinating, and I'm hearing that, I think I hear a methodology in your approach, which is
Thanks.
on, right? Yeah, and it includes things like listening and trust building
Yeah.
and communication, which are not always our strengths as researchers or
Yeah.
maybe as human beings. And I think what I'm so curious about is science communication is now a thing, and you're seeing some training in science
Sure.
communication. What you're doing is different and bigger and longer lasting and maybe harder to carry out, and it takes more time. Do you have a model for what you're doing? Do you share that? Are you who is training folks in doing this type of work? Is it you all? And are you writing this up to share with other organizations?
You've seen most of what I've written up. No, I mean, it's interesting. I would say in the last year plus. I mean, I've also, I spend a lot of my time trying to convince people to give us money. I mean, we're almost 100% grant funded, and there aren't a lot of people who fund what we do, and especially because what we do is not. You have to have a funder who doesn't really care about the topic so much. We've been very lucky that some of the Robert Barron's old and new. So like the Packard Foundation and the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation are really interested in science and information and policymaking as a general topic. So they have been generous with their funding, but they don't really care about PFAS or whatever per se. I mean, they want us to see that we're having an impact, but they're interested in the model. And they have funded some different ones. The Moore Foundation funds the Science and Technology Policy Fellowships. They fund me. They fund, some other ones. And they have asked me many times, why should I give you money instead of them? I mean, they haven't quite done it that way, but they want to see how they fit together. So I am not trained in that sort of theoretical model of understanding of this, but I have been trying to, over the last couple years, really think about, okay, well, what is this model? And you've seen me struggle to explain it a little bit, but and what does that look like, and what are its strengths and what are its weaknesses, and how does it fit with these other ones? We're doing some stuff with the Science and Technology Policy Fellowship Program at AAAS, which I was one once. How can we activate the alumni network? And they're also, what I see is they're, this is a very long answer, and I'm not sure it's answering your question, but they are starting, there's one thing that they're doing is a new thing in the Science and Technology Policy Fellowship Program is they had a cohort of AI fellows. So fellows, where I said before that you just go there as you're a scientist, and we just want a scientist. They had specific AI fellows. So they're now a little bit taking an attribute of another kind of approach, which is people who are experts on a particular topic. That's one of the attributes of my project, right? My approach is this, we bring scientists who are experts on a specific topic to talk about that with policymakers. We are looking at, well, the way we work, it takes months and years, right? Are there ways of taking some of the attributes of what we do, which is this partnership and these networks that we have built, but that doesn't require us to effectively become subject matter experts or build these big expert networks. So we are working actually we're doing 2 pilots right now. One is with a state-based science and technology policy fellowship program, where these state fellows write what they call science notes, right? So a state legislator will say, this happens to be in Missouri, will say, we're thinking about this issue, can you tell me about the science? And we'll write like a 2-page science note. In Missouri, the Missouri Science and Technology Policy something or other, most policy program, they've written hundreds of them, right? So I gotta assume that many of those topics would also be interesting in Indiana or Michigan or Ohio or wherever else. So what we're trying to do is we are working on a pilot, working with somebody who was a fellow in Missouri to put together a webinar, kind of thing. I need to call it something else because everybody's like, oh God, kill me, another webinar. But a virtual engagement with some experts. And then we will work with our partners to try to take that to a much wider audience. So, and then the other pilot we're doing is with people actually at Science Magazine who are like, we publish a bunch of papers on stuff, and sometimes it's not just one, the latest new one, but there's been multiple of them. So that we think are policy relevant and interesting. So we're going to partner with them. We haven't picked a topic yet on that one to do. So that's where we are trying to take an attribute of our model, but also, an attributes of other models, and see, where can we get the best of both, in different kinds of ways. So I've been thinking a lot about your question about these, how do these things fit together, and what are they, and how do you talk about them? But I'm, as you can see, not extraordinarily articulated at it. Articulate.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Michael Fernandez. And certainly thank all of you for being here today. We just want to give you a little gift. Thank you very much. On behalf of CS3, and please check out our future events, including next week, the alumni panel. So stick around, there's some food, and thank you for being here today.
I'm happy to